The question is that the bill be now read the second time. The Honourable Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm delighted to be rising to speak on this bill, the Electoral Amendment Alternative Voting Procedures Bill. It's one that's been in the works for quite some time, and I'm always delighted to be able to support efforts in this place to strengthen our democracy, to strengthen our electoral system, and in particular to do that by making it more robust in terms of accessibility and people's ability to be participating as is their right, which is certainly the fundamental intent of this bill, and the impact it's going to have is going to be considerable for many Tasmanians, because the fact of the matter is there are a range of Tasmanians who have effectively been excluded from our voting system thus far. There are people who have not been able to give effect to their fundamental basic right in a democracy, which is to cast a vote in an election. And there's been practical barriers to that. There have been some legislative barriers to that. And hopefully what we've got here today to consider in this bill is really good solutions to a range of those matters, and that will mean that potentially, should the bill pass this place, as I hope it will, we will now see Tasmanians able to give effect to that fundamental democratic right of casting a vote. Enfranchisement is such a cherished right in Australia, Mr. President. It's something that we as a country and of course as a state should be incredibly proud of in terms of our country's record here. The fact that we have the universal vote here and that we have it as a compulsory element of our democratic process, I think is excellent. And I think that's because it does two things. It puts an imperative both on individuals in our society to undertake that right in a democratic process. We must do it. But it also, and I think this is really important, by making voting compulsory in our country, what we have done is put an imperative on the state to ensure that voting is able to be done safely and accessibly by all citizens, and that people have information that they require to do it and can undertake that required activity. So I think the compulsory nature of our vote in this country is good on both those fronts. What it says to us as individuals in terms of what we need to do as part of our citizenship, but also what it says to us as a state, the state, in terms of providing the facilities and the ability for people to meet their required voting as citizens. So I think that's really positive. Australia is very innovative when it comes to many matters relating to voting and electoral issues. Secret vote, secret ballot comes from Australia initially too, which is another obviously excellent democratic endeavour that really does ensure people can safely give effect to their political voice through a secret ballot at an election time. So having said that, Mr. President, I'm certainly a regular advocate for strengthening our democracy and strengthening our electoral system, and that's why I was absolutely delighted just last year to finally have achieved something that I really had focused on for a while, which was to put in place a Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, our first ever Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters in this state, which we've now established as of last year. And what that is providing for us is first and foremost a statement from this Parliament that that is a matter of importance to us, that as a Parliament we regard the regular oversight, scrutiny and review of our electoral systems as such an important matter it warrants a standing committee of this place to undertake that scrutiny and review. And we've put that in place, and we are now in fact embarking, and people can see for themselves on our parliamentary website, that committee is embarking on pieces of work related to reviewing elections from last year and also looking at a piece of legislation referred to it by this chamber. So that's incredibly positive. And certainly this issue relating to the accessibility of voting for people who have barriers in place to voting at the present time, whether that's people with disability or older people or people with low literacy, all sorts of circumstances might be a barrier, but that has come up in the work of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters in reviewing the 2024 elections. It was raised in submissions to that committee, and it is something that's been discussed by community advocates for some years now. And I'd like to particularly pay, or acknowledge really, and thank those community advocates, whether it's organisations like Disability Voices Tasmania or Speak Out, Blind Citizens Tasmania, COTA, and also individual advocates in the community who have been raising this now for some years, who've engaged in processes internally with the Electoral Commission in recent years, who have worked with the government and with the department to give effect to what we're seeing here today. Well done to those advocates. It does take persistence and time, but hopefully this is a demonstration of where that can pay off and result in a tangible change for the better. Mr. President, we certainly haven't had a level playing field when it comes to casting a vote in this state. And I think that that's something that's recognised in this bill, bill with the inclusion of the objective there, right at the start of these parts that are being inserted into our Electoral Act. The objective makes it really clear. And I'm just going to speak to the wording of it, because we did in our briefings have a little discussion around the wording of the object of Division 9A, which is being inserted. It says the object of this division is to ensure that electors of all abilities and needs are reasonably provided with the opportunity to vote at an election. It's very specifically requested to be included here by those community advocates who have been working towards this change, and I think they were right to do that. What it does acknowledge by having an objective here at the beginning of this division, new Division 9A, is basically to highlight the fact that the Act previously did actually not meet the needs of all Tasmanians, did actually present barriers to a whole range of Tasmanians from undertaking the activities required in the Act. And so putting this objective here to say that this is to ensure that electors of all abilities and needs are reasonably provided with the opportunity to vote in an election is a nice, clear indication that that's the intent of this inclusion. And I think that's positive. It might be that there's conversations to be had about the wording, but in checking with those stakeholders, Mr. President, I know they're comfortable with this wording. So I support that and support their advocacy to see an object included. Mr. President, this is a bill that recognises that we've had gaps, that we haven't had a level playing field, that people have been prevented. And in fact, we heard just from during our briefings today, people even being reluctant to become citizens who are not actually able to then give effect to their right as a citizen to cast a vote at an election because of the gaps that we have had and the insufficiency of our arrangements to provide the opportunity for everyone to cast a vote. And that's incredibly sad. We do not want people deterred or prevented from thinking that they can become citizens and have full rights of citizenship because of an insufficiency in our legislation. So hopefully this will see an end to that. This bill will see an end to that. I'd like to thank the department for the briefing they provided to us, as well as to the advocates that we heard from as well in briefings. We certainly were able to clarify a few points there, which I was really pleased about. I'm going to talk through a couple of aspects of the bill and just make sure that I've got my views on some of these matters on the record. Things that I think are very positive in the bill, for sure, are the fact that there is a stated obligation that there should be consultation. So when the Commission is doing its two key roles here in this legislation, and those two key roles are to identify that there is a need for a special procedure for a cohort of people or certain people to be able to cast a vote, so identifying that there's a need, and then if that need is identified, then designing appropriate procedures for those people, personal people, to be able to cast a vote. At those two stages, there's a requirement that consultation should occur. And I think that that's an important recognition that there needs to be discussion, particularly, I would say, in the design of the appropriate procedures for voting, in that design process to ensure that it will meet the needs of people who have faced a barrier to voting. Consultation will ensure that we get it right, that we don't potentially have unintended consequences where we're trying to do the right thing but haven't quite hit the mark. I am also pleased about the fact that not only will we have that expectation set with this legislation that consultation occurs, we will then, because we have our Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, we'll have a mechanism here in the Parliament to be able to then check back. So when we review election processes via that committee, we'll have the opportunity to be able to interrogate and look at the way in which consultation perhaps occurred around the identification of the need for special procedures and then the design of those special procedures. We'll be able to identify if consultation occurred adequately and effectively. We'll be able to hear about that process and document it. So I think that that's a really, not only is it good to have it a requirement in the legislation, it's also useful to know that we'll be able to have that closing the loop oversight through the Electoral Matters Committee. Mr. President, I'm also very pleased that we are ensuring that we're preserving that really precious concept of a secret vote in any procedures. Now, we know that that's been in place in the current Act, where we've had arrangements for people to be able to make phone votes, for example, when they are geographically afar, when they're not here. People have been able to vote by phone, and that's a two-stage process to ensure that their secrecy, the secrecy of their vote is preserved, that we are at the first stage of that voting process authenticate that they are in fact a valid voter and registered, and then it shifts to a second stage of the process at arm's length for them to cast their vote in a secret fashion. So the expectation is set that as we have had those arrangements in place for phone voting for people who are outside the state, we'll now also, when we look at other sorts of procedures here internally in the state for people who need a variety of procedures to make their vote, we'll have the expectation that those two stages are also preserved, the authentication of them as voters and the secrecy of their vote being able to be maintained. Mr. President, there were some concerns that were raised potentially with us by advocates, but they were at pains to tell us that these were matters that they did not see as urgent in terms of addressing today in this bill with, for example, amendments or the like, that this was something that could be an ongoing conversation, that it is something that we might monitor how things play out should this bill pass and we see it begin to be utilised in upcoming elections. And then it may be that we, on reflection and review down the track, continue to maybe tweak or improve arrangements or identify other ways that we need to, or other people we may need to consider in relation to these measures. So some of the things that were raised that we may have further discussion on down the track were in relation to the Local Government Act and the elections in the local government sphere, and how arrangements we're putting in place here might also be replicated for consistency in a local government context. And I think that we've got a pretty clear indication there's a likelihood, given that there's some reform in that space right now in relation to local government, that we might see that play out nice and straightforwardly. We're pretty good about consistency across elections at a state and local government level, and I'm sure that intention is to continue. One of the matters that was potentially a concern related to whether resourcing might become a constraint here in giving effect to the intention of this legislation. Because of some of the wording that is in the bill, I'll just find the part that speaks about it. It's here in where we're inserting a section 130C, which is related to the Commission may approve alternative voting procedures. And in terms of that approval of those procedures, 130C 4A talks about the approval is that the Commission has to be satisfied that the approval is warranted, having regard to one, the practicality and security of the alternative voting procedure, and two, the resources required to establish and maintain the alternative voting procedures. I'm sure none of us would like to think that we would not facilitate access to voting for a Tasmanian citizen on the basis that we've decided it's not valuable enough to put the resources to it. I think that what that recognises is that while the Electoral Commission has reserved by law funding, which means it should be able to be provided with funding it requires to do its job, it also has to be mindful of using taxpayer resources in a responsible fashion. And we want to be as targeted as possible with giving effect to the accessibility outcomes of this legislation. We do want people who have genuine barriers in place, who are experiencing genuine barriers to voting, to have those addressed. But this isn't necessarily, for example, about making voting more convenient for people who might not have genuine barriers in place. So we do want to be targeted and mindful that resources required are there and available to be used to remove barriers for people who genuinely have them, but we are not necessarily extending a whole range of measures of voting to everybody in the community just because it happens to be more convenient. That was the impression I had anyway about why we would put something here related to being mindful of resourcing, not in order to block. And again, this is something that if we were, through our Electoral Matters Committee, when we review elections, if we were to begin to hear from Tasmanians who had sought to have access to voting, to address genuine barriers they experienced under this legislation, and then had been told, no, we don't have the resources to do that, then that would be something the Electoral Matters Committee would be very interested to hear, I'm sure, and could be addressed and scrutinised and looked at through that mechanism for future consideration. So again, something that, because we've now got an excellent closed loop there for review and oversight, we will be able to keep an eye on how that plays out in practice. Mr. President, I do note when we had the briefing from stakeholders, we did talk about some terminology, some outdated terminology, which is in the interpretation section. And I know that the member for Elwick jumped on that straight away and has, I think, will be talking to us about an amendment there to perhaps remove that outdated terminology. And I will leave it to the member for Elwick to speak on that in more detail if and when that opportunity arises. I certainly agree with removing outdated terminology and making sure that we have good contemporary language in our legislation. So if that's something we come to consider as an amendment, it's certainly something I am inclined to be supportive of. Let me just flick through while I have a drink, Mr. President. One of the things that advocates had raised with us was that they hoped that there would be some form of ongoing consultative arrangement with the TEC, such as a working group that could be available to be looking at implementation of this legislation, to be providing feedback and working with the TEC to ensure that the outcomes that we are aiming for are actually delivered. We've been given to understand, obviously we didn't have the TEC to brief us, so we can't ask for a commitment on that directly from them, but we've been given to understand that the TEC has recently recruited a position relating to accessibility and inclusion, which may be a very good area of focus then within the TEC to be working with external stakeholders. It may be that there's a decision made to establish an ongoing working group. I would hope to see, if not that specifically, at least some sort of intention and mechanism to ensure ongoing connection with community stakeholders and active seeking of their input and review of how things are being rolled out. So, Mr. President, I'm interested to see in practice how we go with this. We've had little efforts before to try to make our voting more accessible. We've had voting machines, but only for people with vision impairment or print disability, but only in very limited locations around the state. So again, given Tasmania's population is very dispersed and outside of main city areas, to just have a couple of locations in the urban areas of major cities hasn't really helped many Tasmanians so far with those efforts. We've had the procedures in place for phone voting, but only for people outside the state, so that hasn't helped people within the state who might have certain print disability or vision issues or otherwise been not able to get to access their voting right. Here we've had these efforts in the past, and hopefully what this does with this legislation is tie things together to have a much more comprehensive approach and empower the Commission. That's effectively what it's doing. It's empowering the Commission, taking away any doubt that the Commission has the ability to firstly identify a need, to have special procedures considered, and then to consider what those procedures should be for that specifically identified need. And so giving a head of power there to the Commission to do that will remove any of the doubt that we've sort of had hanging over in recent years about what the Commission could or couldn't do in terms of authorising other forms of voting for people with barriers. I'm quite interested too to see where this conversation will take us next. Once we do introduce, and I hope we do in passing the legislation today, once we do introduce this and empower the Commission to be addressing the barriers in this way, I think that we will see further discussion about some specific types of barriers people are experiencing and how we might best go about solving those barriers. And here I'm thinking particularly of people with non-English speaking backgrounds. I'm thinking about people who are housebound, for example, and for whom postal voting is not particularly accessible at the moment. They still face very significant barriers, even if technically they could be making arrangements for postal voting. I think that we've got issues around literacy which we need to be thinking more about in terms of empowering people to give effect to their basic democratic right to cast a vote. So I think that's lots of good conversations to come, Mr. President. I'm very happy today to be, as I said, part of this Chamber's consideration of the bill to bring this long worked for change into our Electoral Act and into the way we conduct elections. I think it's going to be so positive for the Electoral Commission to know that it now has the power to address the needs of Tasmanian voters where they're facing certain sorts of barriers, and it's a good explicit statement that is we recognise as a state our responsibility to ensure that that all Tasmanians can give effect to their democratic right and place their vote secretly and safely for any elections that we hold in this state, whether that's at a state level, whether it's a local government level or whatever. I think we will ultimately see that statement flow through and make the requisite changes elsewhere too. So, Mr President, I certainly support the bill and I look forward to hearing from other members.